Hey there, I am Alexis Knight, and welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Here we dive into the cases that split public opinion, those big controversial stories where it's hard to draw a clear line between influence and mental state and the true motivation behind a crime. We'll explore the facts and arguments and leave the verdict up to you. Let's get into it. In this episode, we're going to get into the mysterious death of Abraham Shakespeare, a Florida man who won millions in the lottery, only to disappear shortly after. Was his death a calculated murder orchestrated by his so-called friend, Dee Dee Moore? Or was it an act of self-defense? We will examine the evidence and the motives and the controversies that continue to divide public opinion. Listen, analyze the facts, and decide for yourself. All right, imagine winning $30 million overnight. One day you're struggling to make ends meet, and the next you are a millionaire with more money than you ever imagined. But with wealth comes unexpected challenges, new friends, and hidden enemies. This is exactly what happened to Abraham Shakespeare, a simple man from Florida who won big in the lottery. And then just a few years later, he vanished without a trace. Enter Dee Dee Moore, a woman who appeared out of nowhere, claiming to help Abraham manage his newfound wealth and shield him from those who wanted to exploit him. She called herself his friend, his confidant, the one person who genuinely cared. But when Abraham disappeared and his body was later discovered buried under concrete on her property, well, questions arose. Was Dee Dee a cunning murderer driven by greed? Or was she simply a good Samaritan who got caught up in circumstances beyond her control? Dee Dee Moore insists she was trying to protect Abraham from the vultures that circled him after his winning lottery. She says he went into hiding to escape those who wanted a piece of his fortune, but the authorities, they painted a different picture. They accused her of manipulating Abraham, taking over his money, and ultimately ending his life to gain control of his assets. So let's take a moment. What really happened here? Was Dee Dee Moore a friend who took a wrong turn in her efforts to protect someone in need? Or was she a master manipulator who saw an opportunity and took it, no matter what the cost? We are going to dive into the life and mysterious death of lottery winner Abraham Shakespeare, a man whose dreams of financial freedom ended in tragedy. Was his death the result of a cold-blooded scheme or an unfortunate accident born out of desperation? As we unfold this puzzling case, remember to ask yourself, was this murder or was it self-defense? This story begins in 2006 when Abraham Shakespeare, a truck driver with an 8th grade education, bought a lottery ticket at a gas station in Frostproof, Florida. Against all odds, he wins, claiming a staggering $30 million prize. Abraham was a quiet, unassuming man, known in his community for his kindness and his simplicity. He had grown up in poverty. He had worked hard his whole life, never expecting such a windfall. The money was supposed to be a dream come true. But instead of bringing happiness, the lottery win brought trouble. Almost immediately, Abraham was surrounded by people. They were asking for loans and business investments and handouts. He didn't know how to manage the money or who he could even trust. Within a few years, much of it was gone, and Abraham was feeling overwhelmed and betrayed by the very people he thought were his friends. In 2008, Dee Dee Moore entered his life, a self-described businesswoman. Dee Dee claimed she could help Abraham manage his finances, protect his remaining assets, and give him peace of mind. She promised to take the burden off his shoulders, to keep the vultures at bay. But as it turned out, Dee Dee's help came at a price. Was she really there to protect him, or did she have a different agenda all along? And this is where the story takes a dark turn. Abraham Shakespeare's life took a dramatic turn after his lottery win. The money, which he hoped would be a blessing, it quickly became a burden. And don't we always wonder, how does this work? What happens to these people after they win all this money, as we look at them so enviously, right? Well, his friends, family, and even strangers, they were hounding him for loans and business investments and financial favors. And he was overwhelmed by the pressure. And Abraham began to withdraw from those around him because he was unsure of whom to trust. Then in late 2008, a woman named Dee Dee Moore enters his life. She presents herself as this savvy businesswoman who had a keen interest in helping Abraham protect his remaining future. She approached him with what seemed like a lifeline at the time. It was a plan to safeguard his money from the numerous people trying to take advantage of him. Dee Dee quickly became involved in every aspect of Abraham's financial affairs. She persuaded him to transfer his assets to her management, promising to shield him from those she labeled as greedy opportunists. Dee Dee took control of Abraham's bank accounts, his real estate holdings, and even set up a limited liability corporation in his name. And she was the manager. Okay, now, what were the first signs of manipulation here? Well, friends and family of Abraham, they start to notice that he was becoming increasingly isolated after Dee Dee came into the picture. She often acted like a gatekeeper, filtering who could see or speak to Abraham. She would claim he was tired or didn't want to be bothered. Well, Dee Dee's story about Abraham's whereabouts, it often changed. To some, she said he was traveling, while to others she would say, well, he was hiding to avoid the people trying to get money from him. The inconsistencies raised eyebrows among those closest to Abraham, who found it very strange that he had cut off all contact with them without even a warning. By early 2009, Abraham had effectively vanished. Dee Dee claimed he had decided to just get away from it all and move to some unknown location to avoid the constant harassment over his money. But when people began asking questions, it got a little dicey. Dee Dee provided text messages supposedly from Abraham saying that he was fine and he just didn't want to be found. However, those who knew Abraham well doubted the authenticity of these messages. He was not known to be proficient with texting, and he often relied on others to handle such matters. When questioned, Dee Dee insisted that she was the only one who had his contact information and that he was safe and sound, and she was just tired of being bothered by everybody. By late 2009, though, concern for Abraham's safety grew. His family reported him missing by the police. At first, Dee Dee cooperated with investors, maintaining her story that Abraham had simply decided to just disappear for a while. However, now police become suspicious of Dee Dee when she began offering financial incentives to individuals in Abraham's circle to corroborate her story. She even approached one of Abraham's friends with a bribe, asking him to tell the police he had seen Abraham alive and well. This attempt to manipulate witnesses raised major red flags for law enforcement. Now, by January of 2010, after months of investigation, police received a tip from one of Dee Dee's associates. The tip led them to the backyard of a property owned by Dee Dee Moore, where they discovered a concrete slab. Yep. Now, underneath the slab, they find the remains of Abraham Shakespeare, buried in a shallow grave. He had been shot twice in the chest, and the decomposition of the body indicated he had been dead for months, most likely since April of 2009. The discovery of Abraham's body shattered Dee Dee's story. Her narrative of a reclusive millionaire in hiding no longer held up. Police arrested Dee Dee Moore on charges of first-degree murder, believing she had killed Abraham to gain control of his assets. investigators uncovered a web of financial deceit that painted Dee Dee Moore as a manipulative predator. They found that she had methodically drained Abraham's bank accounts, transferred his properties into her name, and used his money to purchase luxury cars, vacations, and lavish gifts for herself and her family. She had written checks from Abraham's accounts. She'd even forged his signature. She even attempted to sell his remaining assets after his death. It became clear that Dee Dee's intention was to control every penny of Abraham's fortune. Police also found that Dee Dee had fabricated letters and documents supposedly from Abraham, including a handwritten note where he purportedly stated he was leaving his fortune to her. Forensic experts testified that the handwriting was inconsistent with Abraham's and suggested that Dee Dee had forged the documents. Dee Dee's behavior during the investigation, it raised further suspicions. At one point, she offers to pay an undercover police officer posing as a potential witness to lie about seeing Abraham alive after his disappearance. The officer recorded their conversations in which Dee Dee was heard trying to create this false narrative to cover up the crime. Several witnesses testified that Dee Dee had acted strangely in the months following Abraham's disappearance. One of her employees revealed that Dee Dee had asked him to pour the concrete slab in her backyard, claiming it was for a new garage or some improvement project. The employee also stated that Dee Dee appeared nervous and agitated during the process. Another witness, a former boyfriend, he claimed that Dee Dee had confessed to killing Abraham in a moment of panic. She allegedly told him that she shot Abraham in self-defense because he had threatened her during an argument. The prosecution, however, dismissed this claim because they saw it as an attempt by Dee Dee to concoct a story to try to save herself. As the evidence against her mounted, Dee Dee Moore's story evolved. Initially, she maintained that Abraham was alive and hiding. When that narrative fell apart, though, she shifted to suggesting that she had killed Abraham in self-defense. Her account of the events kept changing, with new details that seemed designed to fit the latest revelations by the police. Dee Dee's inconsistent explanations here and the lack of any corroborating evidence, it made it difficult for anyone, including her own defense team, to maintain a coherent narrative of innocence. Dee Dee Moore was charged with first-degree murder, and her arrest, it sparked a media frenzy. The public was both fascinated and horrified by this case. There was a woman here who had claimed to be a friend and a protector of Abraham, but was now accused of murdering him in cold blood. So, of course, this case quickly becomes a public spectacle, with debates raging over Dee Dee's true intentions. Was she a woman who was caught up in a desperate situation? A woman who made a terrible mistake? Or was she a cold-blooded killer who manipulated and ultimately eliminated her victim for her own financial gain? Well, the trial was set, and the questions only deepened as the evidence continued to unfold. Okay, well, we're going to jump forward here because time does pass by as everything gets settled and people get their things in order. Now, when Dee Dee Moore's trial began in December of 2012, it quickly became a high-profile case filled with shocking revelations, conflicting testimonies, and very dramatic twists. The prosecution and the defense, they present starkly different portrayals of this woman, Dee Dee Moore, her character, her intentions, and her involvement in Abraham Shakespeare's death. The prosecution, led by State Attorney Jay Pruner, he presented Dee Dee Moore as this cold-blooded predator who for sure manipulated, exploited, and ultimately murdered Abraham Shakespeare so that she could gain control of his lottery winnings. The prosecution meticulously traced the financial transactions that took place after Dee Dee entered Abraham's life. They showed how she gradually siphoned millions from his accounts, transferring his properties to her name, and took over his financial assets. They argued that these actions were not those of a benevolent guardian, but of a calculating opportunist who saw Abraham's wealth as her ticket to a lavish lifestyle. The prosecution brought in forensic accountants to demonstrate how Dee Dee had manipulated Abraham into signing over his assets. They emphasized that Dee Dee's actions were premeditated and carefully planned, showing a clear intent to defraud and ultimately eliminate Abraham once he was, no longer useful to her. The prosecution contended that Dee Dee's claim of self-defense, it didn't align with the physical evidence. They pointed out that Abraham had been shot twice in the chest, and it was at close range. This was in a manner inconsistent with a spontaneous act of self-defense. Forensic experts testified that the trajectory of the bullets suggested a deliberate act aimed to kill, not a struggle. The prosecution also highlighted that there were zero signs of a struggle at the crime scene. No defensive wounds on Dee Dee, no witnesses to support her version of events. They argued that if Dee Dee had truly acted in self-defense, there would have been some physical evidence to back up her story. They also focused heavily on Dee Dee's numerous conflicting accounts of Abraham's actual disappearance. Initially, she claimed he was in hiding, only to change her story multiple times as the investigation unfolded. The prosecution presented recorded conversations in which Dee Dee was caught bribing witnesses and fabricating evidence, suggesting that she was desperate to cover her tracks and divert suspicion away from herself. They argued that her inconsistent narratives were attempts to manipulate the truth, casting doubt on her credibility and revealing a pattern of deceit that pointed to her guilt. They presented witness testimonies from people who had interacted with Dee Dee after Abraham had gone missing. These witnesses described Dee Dee as controlling and deceptive and untrustworthy. One key witness, a former associate, testified that Dee Dee had boasted about manipulating Abraham and viewed him as a cash cow. They argued that Dee Dee's behavior after the crime, paying people to fabricate evidence, attempting to sell Abraham's assets, and maintaining her lavish lifestyle was not consistent with someone who had acted in self-defense. The prosecution had a lot to go on, and it all sounded in line. But there is also the defense and the other side of the story, the misunderstood woman who was caught in a bad situation. The defense, led by Byron Heilman, painted a different picture than the prosecution, because they argued that Dee Dee Moore was not a murderer, but she was a woman who had been entangled in a tragic situation that really was beyond her control. The defense suggested that Abraham Shakespeare, he was not as innocent as he appeared. They pointed to his past, which included some minor run-ins with the law, to argue that he had a temper and that he could be very unpredictable. The defense alleged that Abraham had threatened Dee Dee during a heated argument, and she had acted in self-defense, fearing for her life. The defense portrayed Dee Dee as a woman who found herself in a dangerous situation, and that she acted in the heat of the moment. They argued that Abraham's death, while tragic, was not premeditated, but instead it was a desperate act of self-preservation. The defense argued that Dee Dee Moore had no reason to kill Abraham Shakespeare. They claimed that she was genuinely, really trying to help him manage his money and protect him from people who wanted to exploit his newfound wealth. They pointed out that Dee Dee had, in fact, given Abraham financial advice and helped him to avoid several bad investments. The defense also argued that if Dee Dee wanted to kill Abraham for his money, she could have done it a lot sooner. Instead, they contended that she worked for over a year to help protect his assets, suggesting that her intentions were not as malicious as the prosecution claimed. The defense pointed out that there was no real direct evidence linking Dee Dee to this murder. They argued that much of the prosecution's case was based on circumstantial evidence and assumptions about Dee Dee's character rather than hard facts. The defense brought in their own forensic experts to challenge the prosecution's narrative, and they argued that the forensic evidence was just not as clear-cut as the prosecution suggested, pointing out possible flaws in the bullet trajectory analysis, and also questioning the accuracy of the timeline that was established by the prosecution. The defense suggested that Dee Dee Moore had been unfairly vilified in the media, which portrayed her as a gold digger and a black widow. They argued that this public narrative had biased the investigation and the prosecution's case, making it pretty much impossible for Dee Dee to receive a fair trial. They asked the jury to look beyond the sensational headlines and consider whether the evidence truly proved Dee Dee's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay, so both sides have presented pretty compelling arguments. All right, so both sides have presented compelling arguments. They both have a lot to say. Let's look at the key points of contention. The central question was whether Dee Dee had acted out of fear for her life, self-defense, or premeditated intent to kill, calculated murder. The prosecution argued that this shooting was deliberate, while the defense suggested it was an act of self-defense. Also, was the financial motive compelling here? The prosecution contended that Dee Dee's actions were driven by greed and a desire to control Abraham's fortune, while the defense maintained that she had no clear motive for murder. She was genuinely trying to help this guy. So how reliable, then, was the evidence? Well, the prosecution relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. This is true. Dee Dee's inconsistent stories and witness testimonies about her behavior. The defense countered that this evidence was just inconclusive. It was insufficient for any kind of conviction. As this trial drew to a close, the jury faced a daunting task to determine whether Dee Dee Moore was a ruthless killer, or was she a woman caught in a web of unfortunate events. But the courtroom drama, it didn't end there. We are going to explore next the controversy that surrounded this trial, the public reaction, and the broader questions about justice and the motive that still linger today. People are still talking about this case because no one can commit to deciding what really happened here. The trial of Dee Dee Moore, it was not just a legal proceeding. This becomes a media sensation that polarized the public. With each new twist in the investigation, this story of Abraham's disappearance and his death drew more and more attention, sparking a heated debate about Dee Dee's guilt or her innocence, and the public wanted to be involved. But why does this case continue to captivate and divide people so deeply even now? Right? They're drawn in at the time. Well, from the moment Dee Dee Moore was named a suspect, the media jumped right into this story. They had sensational headlines and dramatic narratives. Dee Dee was quickly labeled a black widow and a gold digger, and the public devoured this, every salacious detail. The media's portrayal of Dee Dee painted her in a very specific light. She was a manipulative woman who had preyed on a vulnerable, newly wealthy man. TV programs, online articles, talk shows, they all featured experts and commentators who often speculated about Dee Dee's character, her motives, and possible guilt. This media-driven narrative likely influenced public opinion. It had to, and it still does that today. It's powerful, and it created a widespread perception of Dee Dee's guilt even before the trial started. Now, on the other hand, though, others argue that the media coverage was biased and sensationalized, focusing way too heavily on Dee Dee's faults, while downplaying any evidence that might suggest her innocence. True crime enthusiasts like yourselves and independent journalists pointed out that many details of this case were open to interpretation. They couldn't be just on one side, and the press had failed to provide a balanced view. This case hinged on two conflicting narratives. The prosecution presented Dee Dee as a predator, a manipulative woman who saw an opportunity to enrich herself, and she took it, regardless of the cost. But Dee Dee and her defense team offered a totally different story, that she was a victim of circumstance. She was unfairly painted as a villain by those who misunderstood her intentions. All right, so the supporters of Dee Dee's innocence, a small but vocal group, they argued that Dee Dee was simply trying to help this man manage his money, and that she becomes entangled in a tragic situation that spiraled out of control. They pointed out that there was no direct evidence linking her to the actual murder, and the case against her relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and character assassination. Well, meanwhile, the critics, they argue that her actions were consistent with those of a manipulative con artist. They pointed to her manipulating conflicting stories, her suspicious behavior, and her attempts to bribe witnesses as evidence of a guilty conscience. Because to them, Dee Dee was clearly motivated by greed and self-interest, and they believed she had orchestrated Abraham's murder from the beginning. One of the most debated aspects of this case was Dee Dee's motive. The prosecution argued that Dee Dee was motivated purely by greed, right? Money, stuff. She wanted to control Abraham's fortune, and that she was going to stop at nothing to get that. While the defense keeps saying she was in a desperate situation and she did act in self-defense during a confrontation that escalated unexpectedly. So, all right, we have the greed narrative, and many people found that the prosecution's motive, that it was compelling, right? They believed that Dee Dee saw Abraham's wealth as an easy target, and that she used her charm and her manipulating skills to gain his trust and ultimately just take over his life. The financial evidence showed a clear pattern of exploitation, leading many to conclude and make the final decision that Dee Dee's actions were driven by a desire for wealth and luxury. But then you have the other side. This is always the problem, right? The other side of the public, and everyone's talking about it. They're arguing that the motive of greed was just too simple, too simplistic. They suggested that the evidence against Dee Dee was circumstantial and that the prosecution had relied too heavily on all those character judgments rather than the hard facts, any hard facts. These supporters believed that Dee Dee's account of self-defense, though it was flawed, it was plausible given the lack of any concrete evidence proving premeditation. This case also brought to light deeper issues related to gender dynamics and how women accused of violent crimes are perceived and treated. Because you can't forget there are the cases, and people get all riled up over these, trying to take sides, not able to find a side. And then there are also all these other sub-issues going on in the courtroom or whatever it is that we're looking at. And here, we're looking at gender bias, because many were questioning whether Dee Dee was treated unfairly because she was a woman. Some argued that the media and the public, that they were quick to label her as that black widow, just because it fit a narrative of a manipulative woman preying on a man. They suggested that these stereotypes influenced both the investigation and the prosecution's case, and that potentially it swayed the jury against her. On the other side, others felt Dee Dee had been given every single chance to defend herself, and that her actions spoke louder than any perceived bias. They argued that if a man had committed the same actions, there would not have been any hesitation in declaring him guilty, and they felt that claims of gender bias were unfounded. Now, some of this could be based on actual facts. Are there more men who murder than women? Are there more men who murder in these kinds of situations than women? We don't look beyond what people say sometimes, and this also fuels public opinion. we want them to look at the facts, but then sometimes we don't like what we hear and we don't look at the facts. Not really sure, right? But it goes back and forth. For this, I mean, it was a complete divide among the public. Many saw her as getting that this whole trial was a victory for justice, and others, they just were not convinced and could not be convinced. But for those who did support the verdict of her guilt, they felt that it was just, and they believed the evidence was clear and pointed to her guilt. They were satisfied. To them, this was a straightforward case of a con artist getting what she deserved. But there's always that other side. A significant portion of the public, they were skeptical and stayed skeptical because they felt the case had too many unanswered questions and that the evidence was just so circumstantial, and that Dee Dee had been judged more on her character than any concrete proof. And these individuals, this side, because they are not satisfied, they are still debating this today, whether justice was truly served or whether an innocent woman, confused, had been convicted due to a bias and media sensationalism. I mean, that would be terrible. I mean, beyond the specifics of this Dee Dee Moore case, it does raise important questions about the justice system, the role of the media, and how the public, me, you, all of us, perceive how these things go down and how our perceptions influence legal outcomes. Now, as we close the book on this perplexing case, we're kind of left with more questions than answers. Dee Dee Moore, was she a manipulative con artist who saw a chance for easy money and took it, ending Abraham Shakespeare's life with no remorse? Or was she a woman caught in a tragic and desperate situation, simply trying to protect herself from a man who had grown volatile and threatening? Think about the facts, the financial trail, the changing stories, the attempts to fabricate evidence. Were these the actions of a guilty conscience or a person cornered, trying to survive in a world where she was already deemed guilty by the media and public opinion? We have laid out the evidence, the arguments, and the controversies, but ultimately, because this is so divided, this decision, guilty or innocent, you're going to have to leave that with yourself. What do you think? Was justice served in the trial of Dee Dee Moore? Or is there more to this story than meets the eye? Can we accept the conviction as final? Or is there still room for reasonable doubt? I'd love to know what you think. Until next time, keep questioning, keep digging deeper, and remember, the truth isn't always as clear-cut as we want it to be. This is Alexis Knight. You've been listening to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there. Stay curious. Until next time, this is Alexis Knight.